When people talk about war, they usually picture armed heroes, flags waving high, and proud stories shared around a table full of medals. But my war was different. I didn't carry weapons. I carried syringes. I didn't fight enemy soldiers. I fought my own body, and the one life I wanted to save more than anything. The one that truly mattered. I only held in my arms for a few minutes. The only thing I had time to leave behind was a name, whispered in silence, through tears and a shattered heart. The truth is, for someone like me, a nurse on the battlefield, bringing a new life into the world was almost a crime. Ironic, isn't it? I spent years saving lives while mine was quietly being taken from me. I didn't hide my son out of shame. I hid him to protect him from the same chaos I faced every day. Maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you had to keep your greatest joy a secret just so the world couldn't destroy it. If that's your story, I want you to know you're not alone. Today I've decided to open my heart and tell this story for the first time. Not so you'll feel sorry for me, but to show that even when everything seems lost, a name can hold a whole lifetime. If you're carrying a painful secret too, or holding on to a love the world never let you show, stay with me. Maybe by hearing my story, you'll find there's still time for your pain to turn into peace. Take a deep breath. This journey belongs to both of us. My name is Clarice May Wheeler. I'm 89 years old, and I live in a Methodist nursing home in Kansas, in one of those rooms that smells more like silence than flowers. I'm a thin woman, with short white hair always held back by 2 crooked clips, and my faded moss-green dress has lived through more stories than any photo album. On my dresser there's a miniature train that still whistles when you wind it up. It's one of the last things left from a life that started on the rails. Yes, I was a nurse during the war. Not just anywhere, but on a moving hospital train that cut through the wrecked landscapes of Belgium, carrying blood, prayers, and stories nobody ever wanted to write down. And now, if you're willing to listen with your heart, I'll tell you a war story. But this isn't the kind of story that starts with gunfire. It starts with a quieter kind of pain, a pain that grew deep inside me. Because somewhere between syringes and broken bones, between torn uniforms and soldiers crying for their mothers, I carried a secret in my womb, a secret that already had a name, even before he was born. So please come in. Make yourself comfortable. Imagine you're sitting in my room, hearing a train passing by in the distance, holding a warm cup of tea. I'm just an old lady, but I kept this story like a precious keepsake. And now, it's your turn to hear it. If this stirs something in you, and I believe it will, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who also needs to remember, not every war story ends on the battlefield. It all started with a smell, not with bleeding, not with a fever, not with some soap opera-style morning sickness, but with a smell that stuck to my throat. That scent of rusty iron coming off old dressings, mixed with the sour-sweet stench of milk that had been boiled too long and left forgotten in a corner of the ward. And mind you, I knew smells. I was a nurse. I could smell war before I ever saw it. Fresh blood, pus, alcohol, the vinegar in compresses. I knew them all. But this particular smell, it followed me, like I was the only one who could sense it. And that's what made me uneasy. Because in war, when you feel something no one else does, it's not a sign of sensitivity. It's a sign that something's wrong. Deeply wrong. The train groaned with a mechanical moan, as if it were hauling more than bodies, dragging shattered souls across tracks worn from too much sorrow. The wheels screeched against the rails with the weariness of a world that no longer knew where to go. Inside the carriage, the heat was always suffocating, like the air itself was sick. ventilation? Barely any. And every time that door opened, another wounded man was thrown in, like we were the last stop before oblivion. I had no time for myself, no time for questions, no time to think of anything except stopping the bleeding, calming seizures, giving mouth to boys who should have been in school, not on a stretcher covered in mud and blood. But that smell, it threw me off. I'd spend nights scrubbing rags in cold water, no soap, just rubbing on instinct, trying to find the source of that strange nausea that came in waves, like the train itself was rejecting me. And when I did sleep, my dreams were a mess. Wheat fields with a crib in the center, a muffled cry behind a locked door, a torn letter I tried to piece back together with my mouth. I'd always wake with my hand on my belly, as if I were protecting something that didn't exist yet. Or maybe already did. It took me a while to admit it. War leaves no room to admit anything that isn't physical pain. The invisible kind of pain. The doubt, the what if, that we just tuck under the uniform, pinned to the coat, and keep going. But the body has its own ways of pushing back. I started sweating at weird times. Sounds that used to mean nothing now got under my skin. The morning light, once a relief, started to feel like it was cutting me open. And then one day, while wiping the face of a 17-year-old boy who'd lost both feet to a mine, a wave of dizziness hit me so hard I had to sit on the floor, pretending to tie my shoelace, pretending it was just fatigue. But the boy noticed. He looked at me with pity, the kind of pity no one feels for a nurse, unless something's very, very wrong. That's when I started counting the days. In my head, of course. There were no calendars. War doesn't care about months or moons. But I remembered the last time I bled, and I remembered the exact moment it could have happened. There was no romance, no plan, just fear. Fear and heat and surrender. That kind of surrender that comes from despair, from a need to feel alive when everything around you is dying. It was a human gesture, one that, for a fleeting moment, made me feel like I hadn't vanished completely. And now, maybe, it was catching up with me. I kept working like nothing had changed. Because there was no time to be weak, no time to be a woman, only time to be a nurse. Tireless, invisible, almost mechanical. I delivered babies, but I couldn't admit I was carrying one. It was like we women of war had a silent agreement. Saving lives was allowed. Creating one, that was betrayal. That was reckless. That was a luxury. And maybe it really was. But my body didn't ask permission. It just kept moving forward. And my own war story was starting to write itself between lines of silence, with every shallow breath, with every stolen touch to my belly in the middle of the night. I remember one day clearly. It was raining hard. The train had stopped near a burned-out town. I think it was Arlen, though geography fails me now. And there was a new smell in the air. Charcoal, yes, but also hope. One of the doctors brought fresh milk from a nearby farm. I took one sip and ran to the back of the carriage to vomit. That sour milk haunted me for hours. And there, on my knees between sacks of rags, with my hands pressed to the filthy wooden floor, I understood. It wasn't the milk. It wasn't the iron. It was me. It was what was growing inside me. It was life trying to bloom in the middle of the most shattered battlefield in Europe. I told no one. I couldn't. I didn't have the courage. There was no space for tenderness. I just kept going. I served. I smiled with a dry face. I dressed wounds while fear twisted inside me. With every new typhoid case, every badly handled amputation, I thought, what if my body can't take this? What if this child is as weak as I was at 7 months? What if... But the train kept moving, and the story unfolding in my womb was one no one was reading, no one but me. And even then, I was scared to turn the page. But it all started with a smell. And if you've ever caught a scent that no one else could sense, then maybe you too carry a secret. And maybe this is the right time to remember it. Because some war stories aren't in books. They're in wombs. They're in scents. They're in silence. He came in like all the others, on a makeshift stretcher, covered by a thin blanket that barely hid the outline of bone where an arm used to be. It was late afternoon, and the train shook like it couldn't decide whether to stay or go. I was rinsing gauze in warm water, finishing my 3rd shift in a row. The last thing my body wanted was another wounded man. But there was something different about him. His eyes. It wasn't the injury, or the youth drained by pain. It was the way he looked, like he had already seen everything there was to see. Like nothing could surprise him anymore. And more than that, like there wasn't a single reason left in the world to smile. They placed him in bed 7A, near the window, even though the window was covered with dark cloth because of air raids. I was in charge of triage. He refused to give his full name. Just said, James. He didn't ask for mine. Didn't say thank you. Just turned his face away. Not rudely. More like someone trying to shield what little dignity they had left. A man who didn't want to be seen stripped of strength. I understood. I understood before I even thought about it. And right then something cracked inside me. Because I didn't want to be seen either. I cleaned the skin around the amputation with the gentlest care I could manage. The wound was closing up ugly, raw flesh with necrotic edges. He didn't make a sound. Not one. Just breathed through clenched jaws. As I applied ointment and wrapped a fresh bandage, I looked at his other hand, the one that remained. His fingers were dirty, caked with soil beneath the nails, like he'd crawled his way out of some explosion. And for a moment, I imagined those fingers touching a woman's face. Someone who might be waiting for him back home. Or maybe not. Maybe he had no one. Maybe I knew exactly what that felt like. That night, the ward was full. But the silence between the two of us felt like an untouched bubble. I kept going back to his bedside more often than I needed to. I offered him lemon water, not even knowing if he liked it. Gave him warm vegetable soup. He refused, of course, but drank it anyway, discreetly, while I pretended to look the other way. War teaches us these quiet agreements. One offers care, the other allows it. And when he finally fell asleep, brief and restless, I caught myself watching the curve of his face. It wasn't handsome, not movie star handsome, but there was a pain etched so deep into him it looked like sculpture. And that hurt me, because it felt familiar. I was sculpted on the inside, too. No one saw it. In the days that followed, the train changed routes. We passed through long tunnels, cut through frozen forests, and it felt like the world was slipping farther away. James didn't speak. He muttered things in his sleep, names, numbers, a southern accent that slipped out when he wasn't trying. It was like only there, between morphine and shivers, he allowed himself to exist. And I felt responsible for that. Like every spoonful of soup, every bandage change, was an attempt to stitch back together a human the war had torn apart. I started leaving little notes by his pillow. Silly things. "The soup's better today. We passed a river. The radio played Billie Holiday." I never signed them, and he never replied. But every time I came back, I'd see the paper folded carefully, tucked into the pocket of his blanket. One day I left a note that said, "Do you remember how to smile?" On the next shift, the note was gone, and on the meal tray there was a single dried flower bud, one that could have only been picked outside the train, out of reach for any nurse. That was the first time my heart beat differently since the day I suspected I was carrying something inside me. It was wrong, I know. That wasn't a place for tenderness. But in war, sometimes tenderness is the only way to survive. And I wasn't looking for romance. I was just trying to breathe. So was he. There was something between us that didn't need a name. Just space. He started letting my hands stay. Let me fix his blanket. Touched my wrist with his left hand when I walked away. One time he murmured, "You don't sleep either." It was the longest sentence he ever said to me. I smiled and replied, "I have no one to dream of." He just closed his eyes. But from that night on he slept a little easier. No more shouting. No more thrashing. I knew we wouldn't have time. War doesn't hand out luxuries like promises. But deep down I already knew. That man was the other half of a story I'd never be able to tell alone. A bond that might not last, but would leave roots. Because when I laid down at night, nauseous, dizzy, with my belly aching in silence, I wasn't thinking about myself anymore. I thought of his eyes, and if the little boy or girl growing inside me inherited that look, then it would all be worth it, even if he never knew. The last time I saw him, we were near Brussels. They said he'd be transferred, sent to a rehab camp. He didn't say goodbye, didn't ask for my name. He just looked at me like he was saying, "I understand," and left, hidden under the pillow, a small handkerchief. A handkerchief stained with blood and dirt, but with a name stitched into it. Not his name. A name I'd never heard before. But in that moment I knew. It would be the name I'd give my son. And ever since, whenever someone looks at me without smiling, I remember him. The soldier who didn't know how to smile, but who, without even trying, taught me how to love in silence. And that secret became flesh, became a name, became a war story inside me. It wasn't real fog, not the kind you know, the kind that rolls in at dawn and slowly dissolves, rising from the ground like the breath of cold earth. The fog that night was something else. It was made of smoke, dust, the smell of gunpowder, and the shadows of men running in silence. It was the mixture of everything war can't explain. Urgency, panic, a pulse pounding in your neck, the taste of copper in your mouth, the sound of footsteps that never arrive. War whispers before it screams. And that night, it whispered like a woman on the edge of collapse. The order came suddenly. Immediate evacuation. The train was stopped at a vulnerable junction, a blind spot between two recently bombed villages. Apparently, enemy planes had spotted too many lights coming from our triage car. A mistake. Someone forgot to close the curtain. Or maybe it was just bad luck. But in war, bad luck is like weather. It shows up whether you argue with it or not. When the first blast hit, it felt like the ground cracked open beneath us. The metal frame of the train groaned like it was in pain. The lights flickered. The stretchers rattled. And the radio cut out mid-transmission. That's when I felt the shaking in my body. Not from the blast, but the other kind. Deeper. The kind that happens when instinct screams louder than logic. I grabbed the morphine kit, my small flashlight, and a box of clean bandages. I ran through the train's corridors like I was running through my own memories. Because each car in that hospital on wheels held more than just bodies. It held scenes I'd never be able to forget. The compartment where James had been was supposed to be cleared out, or so I thought. When I stepped in, I tripped over a fallen suitcase and was yanked into a narrow supply cabinet. It was him, James. Eyes wide, hands still stained with black ink. He'd been helping erase medical records when the sirens went off. We crouched there, squeezed between boxes of alcohol and soaked rags. The space was too tight for 2 people. But in war, everything is tight. Time, breath, the chance to feel anything real for a second. We didn't speak. The train rocked like giants were shaking it. The ceiling creaked. Outside, muffled screams, and the sharp chorus of shrapnel tearing through the air. I was shaking from the soles of my feet to my soul. But he stared at me, as if saying, "I'm here." In that dark cabinet, I finally understood that silence can also be shelter. That you don't need words to build a bridge. Sometimes a look is enough. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the scent of death creeping just beyond the metal walls. But I let myself lean into him, let myself breathe near him. James touched my face with a tenderness that almost hurt. No one had touched me like that in years, not even before the war, not even when I was young and still dreamed of veils and vows. The war had stolen that before I ever realized it. And now, there we were, pressed between gauze and bottles, with nothing romantic or poetic about it. And yet, in that moment, our bodies let themselves forget. It was brief, rough, and still so full of care that I cried quietly. I cried while he kissed the side of my neck with his eyes closed. I didn't cry from shame, but from the strange feeling that right in the middle of the end of the world, I had found something that felt like belonging. It was a surrender without promises, no names, no future. I wasn't thinking about pregnancy or consequences. I was only thinking about the warmth of his skin, the way he held me with the one arm he had left, as if saying, "I've got you." And in that moment, he did. When the silence came back, after the third blast hit closer than the others, we knew it had passed. We stayed there a few more minutes, wordless. I straightened my coat. He looked at me with watery eyes, and for the first time I saw a crack in that hardened face. He whispered, "Sorry." I shook my head, whispered back, "It wasn't a mistake." And I tucked that phrase away like a relic, because as strange as it may seem, I knew that moment had changed me forever. In the days that followed, we returned to our routine. Our glances grew more cautious, but there was no space for sentimentality. War doesn't allow continuation. It only gives you the instant. And that instant had passed. I began to feel more than the strange smell. Now my body felt heavy. I had light cramps. My breasts burned at night. And when I touched my belly, something inside seemed to whisper, "It's done." We never spoke of that night again. We didn't need to. It was all there, in every gesture, in every neatly folded handkerchief, in every food tray left with extra care. James seemed quieter, but more present, like he knew too, like he was carrying the secret with me. But I never asked. I never told. Because in war, some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. And every time the fog clung to the train windows, I remembered the red fog, that night when the world could have ended. But instead, began a new life, a small life, a secret life, one that now depended solely on me to survive. I became a mother in that dark cabinet, without certainty, without readiness. But like so many invisible women before me, I became shelter, and that changed me forever. The first thing I felt that morning was nothing, and that's what scared me. Nothing hurt, nothing burned, no dizziness, no sharp pangs in my lower belly, no sudden waves of nausea. It was like my body had entered a kind of silence only someone carrying a secret would understand. Because the worst thing isn't the pain. It's when the pain disappears, when it vanishes, and you suddenly realize something's changed. That was exactly it. The day everything stopped hurting, was the day my soul started carrying more weight than my body. The train was parked near a village whose name I could never quite pronounce. It was spring, but everything still looked like winter. The flowers in the windows were dead, the children hidden, and the church bells rang without hope, as if marking time in a world that no longer believed in new beginnings. I woke up earlier than I needed to, washed my face with cold water, and looked at myself in the crooked metal mirror hanging on the triage car wall. Dark circles under my eyes, a glassy kind of pale, and my eyes, they were dull. But there was something else, a stillness, as if my entire body was asking for silence to focus on another mission. I got dressed slowly, the coat, the thick socks, the worn shoes. I sat on the edge of the bunk bed, hands resting in my lap, and stayed like that for a long while. The train swayed gently, like an old man telling forgotten stories. And in that rhythm, I realized the center of my pain had shifted. It wasn't in my chest anymore. It was lower, as if a second heart had begun to grow inside me. A shy heart, hidden and fragile, but already beating differently. It was the heart of someone who didn't yet exist in the world, but who already existed for me. I spent the whole day surrounded by basins of blood-stained cloth, faded syringes, and muffled screams. A 19-year-old boy lost his left eye. A Belgian woman arrived in labor and the baby was stillborn. An American soldier tried to cut his wrist with a spoon. I moved through it all with the same practiced motions. Quick, firm, emotionless. But inside, every death felt closer. Every birth more symbolic. And deep in my soul, a quiet truth grew like weeds between the rails. I was waiting for a birth too. I just couldn't tell anyone. Not even him. Not even myself out loud. That night I lay down with a different kind of warmth in my body. It wasn't a fever. It was life. A life that chose me in the middle of nowhere. A life that decided to exist even when everything around it screamed that it wasn't the right time. And while others slept or cried quietly, I whispered words that had no one to receive them. Names I tested in my mind. One kept coming back, echoing from James's handkerchief. A simple name. Beautiful. Strong. And I knew that name would be my only inheritance, because there was no father, no paperwork, no home. Just me. And a belly that no longer belonged only to me. That was the day something inside me stopped fighting the impossible. I stopped resisting. I accepted the secret, like someone receiving a gift born of pain. And I decided that, even in silence, I would give the best shelter I could to that tiny war story growing inside me. Because not every moving story has to be spoken out loud to be real. Some are written with heartbeats, with breaths, with sleepless nights, and hands resting on a stomach. And that, my dear, no one can take away from a woman. Bruges looked like a forgotten painting in an attic. Those crooked little brick houses, the still canals like mirrors coated in ash, the silent towers peeking through the smoke. Everything there felt too calm, like it was pretending war had never passed through. But war doesn't need obvious signs to leave its mark. Sometimes it just sits on your doorstep and waits for your soul to wear out. And that's exactly what I felt in Bruges, that the city was just as tired as I was. The train stopped for 2 days, which was rare. A pause that long only happened when the tracks were blocked by rubble, or by too many bodies. This time, it was both. An old bombing had destroyed part of the railway and buried an entire station, people still inside. While the engineers cleared the tracks, the makeshift hospital ran on fumes. And I moved like a broken music box, repeating the same motions, never quite playing the full melody. The head nurse noticed something in me. She didn't say it out loud, but her eyes changed. Maybe it was the way my hands trembled more, or how I'd rest a hand on my belly when I thought no one was watching. She was Belgian, small, all bones, eyes always red, like she lived on the edge of sleep and tears. One day she pulled me aside and asked in broken French, "Tu vas bien? Are you okay?" I smiled, said it was just exhaustion. That's always been our safest lie. Exhaustion. Because no one asks too many questions when you say you're tired. They just nod and walk away. But I wasn't just tired. I was at war, inside a war. My body cried out for rest. My stomach rejected nearly everything. My feet ached inside tight socks. And my heart was beating in 2 rhythms. Sometimes lying in my 3rd-row bunk, I'd feel a twitch, a small flutter deep in my belly. Maybe it was in my head, or maybe it was a sign, a kick, a warning. I didn't know. I only knew that Bruges wasn't where I could stop. In town, people looked at us with a mix of gratitude and unease. Children pointed. The elderly lowered their eyes. A woman who ran a little makeshift market handed me hot tea and held my hand a second longer than expected. She didn't say anything, but her gaze dropped exactly to where my hand was resting on my stomach. And in that moment, I knew she knew. Maybe she had been a nurse, too. Maybe she'd lost a child. Or maybe she just recognized the kind of silence only a mother without a home can know. One night I snuck off the train. I needed air, space, a little bit of sky. I walked to a stone bridge where the city lights flickered on the water like indecisive memories. I sat on an iron bench, pulled my coat up to my chin, and took a deep breath. That's when I cried for the first time in weeks. Not loudly, no sobs, just quiet tears, sliding down slowly like they, too, were tired of holding everything alone. And as they fell, I whispered the name. That name from the handkerchief. Once, twice, 10 times. Like a mantra. Like a baptism no one heard. But on that iron bench with the wind cutting across my skin, it became sacred. I returned to the train with damp eyes, but with a decision burning inside me. No matter what happened, that name would survive. Even if there was no birth certificate. Even if there were no arms to hold him. Even if there was no future. Because naming something is like lighting a candle in the dark. It doesn't erase all the shadows, but it gives you a point of light. And that night, Bruges gave me that. A moment of stillness in the world, so that my heart could keep going, even if no one else was listening. War doesn't warn us when something begins, and it doesn't warn us when something ends. Labor came just like that, without a sign, without a choice, without warmth. I was in the back of the sanitation car, cleaning instruments with rationed alcohol and reused cloth, when the first pain hit me like a hook pulling from the inside. It was past midnight. Most people were asleep. Only a single yellow bulb flickered above the sink, casting long, ghost-like shadows across the wooden floor. It took me a few seconds to realize what was happening. The pain wasn't sharp. It rolled in waves. It was a signal, a call. And unlike anything I'd ever felt, it didn't scare me. It froze me with a strange kind of calm, as if it were saying, "It's time." The second contraction was stronger, and I had to steady myself on the counter. Out of instinct, I looked for hot water, not for myself, but to distract my hands, to pretend I was still the nurse, not the patient. But there was no more pretending. My body, my belly, my soul, everything in me was opening like a wound that war could never heal. I made my way to the dressing room car, locked the door, used a key only the head nurses had. Alone there, among clean linens and expired penicillin bottles, I knelt on a folded blanket and started to breathe like I used to teach other women, like I'd taught that Belgian mother who lost her baby in Bruges. breathe, sweetheart. Just breathe. Now it was me, alone, and all I had was the voice in my head whispering, "Don't make a sound. They can't hear. If they hear, it's over." The train moved slowly, a steady rhythm, as if rocking me. The sound of the tracks became music between the contractions. I felt my skin burn, my belly tighten, my knees shake. I tried not to scream, bit down on a piece of cloth, held onto a towel knotted to a hook on the wall. It was a war inside the war, my body declaring that even in the middle of destruction, it could still create, still carry, still give. The exact moment of birth came between two turns on the rails. A deeper jolt, a scream stuck in my throat, and then silence. A silence that broke with a brief sound, a thin cry, almost shy. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was the truest sound I'd ever heard in my entire war story. I held that tiny being with hands still trembling. He was warm, wet, alive. So alive. I wrapped him in a white cloth, held him to my chest, and I cried. I cried everything I hadn't cried since the night of the red fog. Cried because I couldn't keep him. Cried because I knew it would all be taken from me. Cried for every woman who had been through the same and never told a soul. I was now part of that silent sisterhood. The ones who loved without getting to raise, who carried without getting to hold, who gave names, and nothing more. I stayed there with him, just the two of us, for no more than 20 minutes. Then I took a piece of cloth, the same handkerchief James had left, and wrote the name with a bit of charcoal, folded it gently, tucked it into the wrap, next to his little chest. It was the only record, a name with no last name, a love with no certificate, a child with no mother, but with a story, because even if no one ever called him by that name, I knew, and that was enough. At dawn, I knocked on the car door. One of the Belgian nurses looked at me in surprise, then pity, then urgency. Less than an hour later, a Red Cross ambulance took the baby. They didn't let me follow, didn't say where. Cited security, bombing risks, international protocols. But none of that mattered, because what mattered most had already been taken. All I had left was the name. And even now, when I hear the footsteps of children echoing down the halls of this nursing home, I wonder if one of them, deep down, carries the echo of that name, because that's all I could give, a name. And sometimes, that's more than many ever had. After the Red Cross ambulance pulled away, there was nothing left. Nothing but a faint smell of milk in the air, and the feeling that someone had pulled an invisible thread from inside me. And with it, they took not just the child, but the last fragile piece of my innocence. The train creaked back to life. The wounded started arriving again. The war spun on, its endless cycle of death and patchwork repairs. But inside me, something had stopped. Time, meaning, the will to keep going. I went back to work like someone putting on a badly stitched costume. My movements were the same. My voice stayed calm, my hands steady. But I knew, and maybe a few of the women around me knew too, that I was no longer the same. The woman standing there now was made of scraps, and in the center of my chest, deep down, there was a damp, hollow space where hope used to live. I clung to daily tasks the way someone clings to a branch in the middle of a river. Because stopping meant sinking. During the linen washings, one of the quietest tasks, I caught myself stitching. Not with a real needle, but in thought. I started embroidering in my mind. Little words, small memories, gestures he might one day stumble upon. I began hiding scraps of fabric, with stray letters folded inside the blankets. A J, an S, an H. letters that made sense only to me, but I scattered them like seeds on barren ground. Maybe someone would find them. Maybe not. But it was my way of staying present, even in absence. One day the train stopped near a clearing where the wind was stronger than usual. We hung the sheets to dry in the sun, and in a moment of carelessness, one slipped from my hand. It was white, clean, still damp. It floated upward with a weightless grace that defied gravity, drifting over the tracks like a bird that no longer knew where home was. I ran after it. I shouted, but it vanished into the trees. I stood there, hands empty, eyes glassy, like someone who'd just buried a piece of herself. And that's when I understood. It was exactly that. A symbolic burial. A quiet farewell. That sheet was what I had left of him. Of the idea of him. Of his presence. And now, even that had been taken by the wind. For weeks I returned to that same trail, hoping maybe to see the cloth caught on a branch, or to receive a sign. But there never was one. Instead, I began writing letters. Letters I never sent. Letters that started with, "My dear," and ended with love, Mom. I hid them in the empty compartments of the train, behind boxes of saline, inside tins of gauze. I knew no one would find them. But I needed to write, because writing was the only way to talk to him. The only way to make sure he had existed. That he still did. Inside me. James never knew. I never asked if he suspected. He was transferred days after the birth. Left another handkerchief, folded but blank. Just his scent. And I tucked it away with the letters. I never saw him again. Never heard his name again. But on nights when the train glided a little more gently over the tracks, I closed my eyes and imagined he heard the rails too. That he remembered the night of the red fog. And that, somewhere out there, he also missed something he never got to call a son. The wind-blown sheets started visiting me in dreams. In one of them I saw entire fields covered, white sheets dancing over tall grass. And in the center of each one, a child lay sleeping, peaceful. It was as if I had been part of an entire generation of women who gave birth in silence and had their children scattered to the world. And maybe that's exactly what it was. A war story stitched together by mothers no one saw, no one named, no one held. But I gave a name, and that no one can take from me. Years after the war officially ended, because it never really ends inside us, I reconnected with one of the Belgian nurses who had worked with me on the hospital train. Her name was Matilda. Small, tough, like she'd been carved from tree bark. We ran into each other by chance at a train station in Liège, while I was accompanying a group of American veterans on a symbolic visit to Belgium. She recognized me by the way I pinned up my hair. She said, "You still wear those 2 crooked clips," and laughed with that tired kind of laugh only those who survived war carry in their chest. We talked for a whole hour over bitter tea, and memories stitched together by silence. I didn't know what I was looking for in that conversation. I just knew something inside me still pulsed with the name I had given. And on colder nights, it still whispered through the walls of my room. Matilda told me about an improvised orphanage where some of the war's children had been taken by the Red Cross. She said that during a harsh winter, some of those children were rushed off to avoid starvation and typhoid, and that, to keep them from getting lost among so many transfers, some were given numbers, tattooed, on their necks. As if they were crates, as if they were inventory, as if they were less than human. I swallowed hard. I asked if she knew their names. She shook her head. Many were too small to say their names, and many names were wiped away with the snow. I said nothing, but inside me, the echo of that name, The one I wrote with charcoal on a piece of cloth, detonated like a dormant bomb. What if he had been one of them? What if they erased the only piece of me he had left? His name. I returned to Kansas with a new kind of weight, a mourning without a face. I started writing to adoption agencies across Europe. I wrote with trembling hands, explaining that in 1945, a child had been born on a hospital train and taken away with no record. No one replied. Or when they did, it was with a printed slip. We regret to inform you that no matching information was found. But I kept going. I wrote letters like messages in bottles thrown into the sea. One a week, one a month, then one a year. Until one day, already an old woman, sitting in some waiting room, flipping through an old forgotten magazine on the table, I came across an article about war refugees who had been adopted into different countries and only learned their origins as adults. The story featured the face of a man, maybe 40, 45, black, tall, thin, deep-set eyes, and an expression that hurt to look at. He said he'd always known something was missing, that he'd been adopted by a German family, and that when he turned 10, he discovered a number tattooed behind his ear. Small, faded, 3017. It pierced me, because in that exact moment, my mind went straight to the stretcher number, my train, my shift, the birth record, 3017, triage car, emergency cot, night of a route change. It was on the papers I had hidden. It was in my memory. And though I knew numbers could repeat, that number wasn't just any number. It was the number from the night I gave birth. And now, tattooed on the neck of a man who didn't know who he was, it came back to me like a candle lit in a dark tunnel. I wrote to the magazine's editors, never got a reply. But that same week I dreamed of him. I dreamed I held him without him knowing who I was, that he cried without understanding why, and I whispered his name, that name. And even without understanding, he smiled. And it was the smile James was never able to give. The number on the boy's neck might not prove anything, but to me, it was proof enough, because some war stories don't need birth certificates. They just need a thread between souls. And that day, I felt that maybe the thread was still holding. Whether it was him or not, someone out there was carrying my pain, and that, somehow, was more than nothing. Sometimes when I look at myself in the mirror of this nursing home, I see a woman in a worn dress, shoulders slumped, thinning hair, and hands that still tremble while trying to button the collar. But every now and then I see something else. A silhouette draped in white, mask on her face, eyes alert and voice steady, commanding a hallway full of wounded men. A nurse. The nurse who saved dozens, maybe hundreds. And then, in silence, I ask myself, how many of those women were mothers too? War didn't allow us to name our feelings. We were trained to count gauze, take temperatures, administer IVs with near-mechanical precision. But no one taught us what to do with the love that spilled over, with the tenderness that built up in the corners of our chests, with the instinct that woke up every time we saw a young boy, leg torn off, crying out for his mother in a language we couldn't understand. The nurse's body learned how to heal, but the heart, it longed to hold. That's how I came to understand I wasn't alone. In the years that followed, I met other women like me. Many. Some stayed silent forever. Others let secrets slip in letters, in sad smiles, in long stares at photographs no one else recognized. One of them, named Ruth, told me she too had a child during the Normandy evacuation. She handed him over to the nuns and spent her life visiting churches, hoping to find a familiar face in the stained glass. Another, Lucinda, said she never had confirmation, but suspected her boy had died in a bombed convoy. She never searched. Said it hurt less to imagine he might still be alive somewhere, unaware of who he was. We all carried the same kind of pain, the one you're not allowed to say out loud. The pain of motherhood that never bloomed. The pain of milk that dried up with no mouth. The pain of a name given in secret. And it's a very specific kind of ache, like an invisible thread tying your womb to nothing. You feel like a mother, but have no one to call the son. And at the same time, you feel guilty for still wanting to smile, for still being called ma'am, for still giving advice to younger women, as if that could erase the life you never got to live. There was an afternoon here in the nursing home when a young nurse brought me a flower. She said she admired me, that she wanted to be like me. I thanked her with that smile we learn to give when the heart doesn't have the words. And after she left, I stared at the flower in its vase and thought, if only she knew what it means to be a nurse, and at the same time, mother to no one. But maybe that's what makes us so human, so quietly powerful. We, the women of war, who healed others while bleeding inside, who held strangers' hands while our own remained empty, who fed wounded mouths while our souls begged for a single word of comfort. We were shelter, even without a home of our own. We were life, even when ours had been pulled out at the root. And now, at 89 years old, I look back and understand. Maybe my purpose wasn't only to save lives. Maybe it was also to let a life be born from me, even if it didn't stay. Because bringing a child into the world during a time of darkness is an act of courage. And giving a name, even without a certificate, is an act of love. I was a nurse, but I was a mother too. And even if no one ever called me that, I know. Because my body knows. Because my story knows. And that's why, even without a photo, without a face, without an embrace, he lives in me, in others. In the war story that will never be told in books, but that still beats in the chest of every woman who stitched flesh, washed blood, and somehow still found the strength to love in the dark. On my dresser, in this quiet room, there's a box no one ever opens. It's small, made of lightwood, with edges worn down by time, and a fine crack along the lid, like a subtle scar. I keep it there the way someone keeps a shrine, with reverence, with distance, with care. No one asks about it. And I've never explained. But today, as the late afternoon light slips through the lace curtain, I realize maybe it's time to speak. That box came with me from Belgium. I don't know how I didn't lose it in the transfers, the evacuations, the bombings. But maybe what it carries inside is what kept it whole. The secret. Inside are fragments from a time that no longer exists. A piece of the uniform I wore on the hospital train. A handkerchief that no longer holds his scent, but still carries a bit of dampness around the edges. A tiny lock of hair, tucked inside yellowing paper, and sewn in pale blue thread into the bottom of the box, almost invisible, is the name. That name. It was the only thing I could give him. A name. Stitched with trembling hands, blurred eyes, and a shattered heart. I embroidered it days after the birth, sitting in a dark corner of the sanitation car while the train rumbled north. I remember every stitch, every pause of the needle, the fear of getting it wrong, as if choosing the wrong name might mean losing my son forever. I used blue thread because it was all I had, and deep down, I knew. He was a boy. He was him. I've never shown that box to anyone. Not even to James had I ever had the chance to find him again. Because what's inside doesn't belong to the world. It belongs to the space between war and love. It belongs to time that never passed. To a womb that bled in silence. And now, all these decades later, it is the only proof that he existed. That I existed. That we existed. even if only for a moment. I've thought about burning it, about burying it, about donating it to a war memorial. But I never could, because inside that box is more than memory. It's a promise that even if the world forgot, I didn't. Even if no one ever said his name, I did. And I still do. At night, before sleep, when the wind pushes hard against the nursing home windows, when I hear children laughing in the courtyard, when a nurse drapes a blanket over me and asks if I'm cold, I smile, and I whisper that name, in silence, like a prayer. If he's still alive, if by some miracle the universe carried him this far, maybe that stitched name will reach him somehow, because names hold echoes, and the echo of love is the one sound that never fades. Sometimes what we leave behind in this world isn't a monument or a book or a pretty picture in a frame. Sometimes all we leave is a name embroidered at the bottom of a box, a name spoken only once with a torn heart in the darkness of a war train, a name no one heard, no one recorded, never printed on paper, but one that existed and still does. The war story I carry isn't in military files or in medals I never received. It lives in the folds of a sheet the wind carried away, in the memory of iron and sour milk, in the silence of a cabinet where I hid with James, in the tremor of hands that cut gauze and held a baby for a few moments before letting him go to a fate I never knew. It's in the sound he made, a cry, a breath, the warmth of him on my chest. Today, at 89, I'm not sure of much anymore. Not of dates, not of maps. But I am sure that I was a mother. Even if only briefly. Even if alone. Even if in secret. And maybe that's why I've kept this story hidden all this time. Like someone cupping a lit candle in their palm, afraid the wind will snuff it out. Some names change destinies. Others disappear with time. And then there are the ones no one speaks anymore. But they stay alive simply because someone, somewhere, still whispers them with love. I am that voice. My story doesn't end with a reunion. It doesn't end with justice, or an embrace, or a happy ending. It ends the way it began, with silence. But it's a silence full of presence, of memory, of truth. If you've made it this far, if you listened with an open heart, maybe this story touched something in you too. Maybe you also have a name that hasn't been spoken in years, a box that was never opened, a sheet the wind carried away. If so, know this, you are not alone. I'm here, and there are many of us, invisible women who stitched names while the world was falling apart, who gave life when death seemed like the only certainty, who still remember, even when no one asks anymore. If this story spoke to any part of you, even a part you thought you'd forgotten, I ask you share it. Not for me, but for him, for that name. Because maybe, somewhere, he's still searching for an echo, for a sign, for a word. And maybe it's through you that my voice finally reaches him. Like this video if something stirred in your chest. Leave a comment if you want to share a name, a memory, a gesture. Subscribe to the channel if you want to keep hearing stories time tried to erase. I'll be here, every time someone is ready to listen. Because even in war, even after it, love never stops stitching its own path.